What's up, everybody on YouTube? It's been a while since I made a paintball related video, but you know, I've been kind of thinking a lot about paintball lately. Haven't played. It's been a while since I played. Kind of really wanted to get back into it, and I was kind of browsing around YouTube looking at, you know, paintball videos that, you know, I used to watch, and I came across, you know, 10-15 years ago, Mike Phillips from Tech BB came out with some videos talking about why he thought paintball was dying, and he listed a few things, and, you know, it kind of got me to thinking as to why paintball was dying. And, you know, I kind of wanted to just put a video out there, just kind of put my 2 cents in. You know, I wanted to kind of tell the reasons why I think paintball has been dying, or started dying. I'm kind of going to go off of what Mike from Tech BB said, but, you know, I'll just jump right into it. The first thing I feel like was one of the big killers of paintball. Well, actually, before I get into it, you know, I agree with what Mike said. You know, go watch his videos. You know, he talks about how paintball is marketed to kids, talks about ramping the internet. I think all those things are true, but I think one of the things, you know, going off of that, I think one of the things that really killed paintball was definitely the price. You know, going out, even playing by yourself on a Saturday, really does cost a lot of money, especially, you know, now inflation is absolutely through the roof, and everything is more expensive than ever, and, you know, paintball's right there with it. And, you know, anywhere you go to play paintball, you're spending at least probably $150. You look at your entry fee, that's probably $30 to $40. If you have to rent a gun, that's another $20 or $25. You know, a case of paint, you know, is through the roof. You're looking anywhere from $80 to $100 just for one case of 2,000 paintballs. You know, it's absolutely crazy. With inflation skyrocketing, you know, it's not cheap to go play paintball. And, you know, looking at, you know, parents that want to bring their kids, like, on a birthday party or something, like a kid wants to play paintball for his birthday, gee, you're talking, you know, 10 or 15 kids, you know, $30, $40 a piece for entry money. You're looking at least, you know, probably 4,000 to 6,000 rounds of paint. You're looking at spending $500 or $600 easy, no problem. So I definitely feel like, you know, the price of paintball, you know, and it hasn't just started. You know, paintball was expensive even back when I started playing. I started playing back in about 2008, and I can remember, you know, me wanting to go to a field and play, and my parents couldn't take me. It was too much money. And, you know, that forced, you know, my friends and we were lucky enough to have some property that we built our own field on, and were able to go play, which was, you know, we were fortunate to be able to do that. You know, some people don't have that privilege, and, you know, it's just astronomically expensive. And, you know, especially, you know, when 2008 hit with the you know, the housing recession, you know, that's about when paintball started dying. You know, 2006 to 2008. I think 2008 it was the end of its plateau, and ever since inflation, it's just, you know, it's been really expensive. So going from there, the other thing I wanted to bring up was probably one of the biggest things I think caused the downfall of paintball was technology. Now, I know Mike talked about the internet, but I kind of wanted to expand on that a little bit. You know, I was probably one of the first, you know, I graduated high school in 2015, and my generation was probably one of the first generations to go to school, you know, elementary, middle school, with a computer lab, and we had computer classes every single year. We sat in front of a computer for however many times a week for 40-50 minutes at a time and worked on the computer. And, you know, on top of that, you know, the guys that played paintball, you know, in the early 2000s and the 90s, you know, figured those guys were born the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. You know, those guys, when they were born, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have technology like we do today. you know, video games weren't really around. I mean, yeah, you had some, but it wasn't like it was, you know, 15, 20 years ago when they really started to get big. And you know, those guys were born without, you know, video games or, you know, technology, smartphones, whatever. And when those guys stopped playing paintball, you know, maybe they started to have kids, they got married, you know, they kind of slowed down. And let's say, you know, anywhere from the late 90s, you know, the early 90s to the 2000s, their kids, you know, my generation, we were the first ones to really grow up with computers. We're born with computers. And I think that's what one of the biggest things that, you know, that killed paintball. On top of ramp, you know, Mike talked about ramping. On top of ramping being introduced in 2006, I mean, got big in 2006 with the Smart Parts Nerve. You know, look what else happened in 2006. The Xbox 360 came out. You had the Nintendo Wii came out. And, you know, after that, smartphones became a big thing. And I became a big thing. And you know, the iPod Touch came out. And all those things came out at that time. You know, like I remember when those things came out. You know, kids that were born with it, you know, they wanted to play it. You know, born with the technology. You know, and I mean, I remember when Modern Warfare 2 came out, and that was one of the biggest game releases I have ever seen. I mean, when I was in school, you know, you ask any kid, any of them, they all had an Xbox 360 or a Wii or a PS3, and they all played Modern Warfare 2. They played it for hours on end. You know, World at War, they played that. Nazi Zombies, they played that for hours on end. And I feel like, you know, people could say, you know, oh, well, video games were, you know, there are consoles that came out, you know, the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox and the N64. You know, but the thing is those guys, you know, the people that played that, you know, the technology, the graphics, the intensity of the games, and, you know, just the quality of gameplay wasn't the same back then as it was, you know, let's say like when the Xbox 360, you know, or the PS3 came out. And, you know, all of a sudden, you know, you got all these kids, that's all they wanted to do was play video games. I can remember when I was a kid, I can remember kids on my street, all they did all weekend was play video games. You know, they'd be inside non-stop playing video games, and their parents let them. So I think that's another thing that killed paintball. And, you know, the nail in the coffin, you know, Mike Phillips, he talked about how paintball was being marketed to kids. Well, if it's being marketed to kids and all kids want to do is play Xbox, you know, then who's going to go play paintball? You know, and none of them did, because, you know, they grew up with video games. It was a big part of our lives, and, you know, that's what they wanted to do. And, you know, people that were born in, like, you know, the 70s and the 80s, they didn't have video games like we did. There was a more of an incentive to go out and play that versus sit inside and play video games. So, I mean, those are the two big things that I think, you know, killed paintball. And, you know, and it's still happening today. You know, there's, you know, what, I don't even know what Xbox are on. The Xbox One, there's probably one, there's a PS5 out now. I mean, shit, I don't know any kid that plays paint, or any guy that plays paintball so often anymore. I mean, you know, back when I was growing up, you know, it was really kids that played, unless you were an adult that came to, you know, play, you know, bring your kids to go play on a birthday party, unless you got into like tournaments or scenario games. But, you know, like my dad was on a paintball team, and that was the mid 80s. You know, you don't see that nowadays. You know, back then it was an adult thing, just like Mike talked about. You know, now with video games, it's just, I think really that's what killed paintball. So I mean overall there's a multitude of things, and that's just what I think. So, you know, if you guys think something different, put a comment on this video. Thanks.